It appears that we have a quorum.
That's correct.
So if we can have a call to order.
Okay. Would you like to lead us in the flag salute, Mr. Chair?
Yes. Now put your hand over your heart and say the Pledge of Allegiance.
I
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty, justice for all.
Okay. Are we ready for a roll call? Yes, Mr. Chair, are we ready for a roll call?
Yes, yes, please.
Thank you. Director Johnson.
Here.
Director Anderson.
Here.
Director Carr.
Here.
Director Lapidus.
Here.
And Director Woodruff.
I'm here.
Thank you. Okay, at this time, we also need to administer the oath for Director Woodruff. She wasn't covered under the last administration of oath for our directors.
Okay.
Mr. McNulty, did you want me to go ahead and administer that oath?
Yes,
Okay.
please do that.
Kara, I'm going to read the administration of oath, and if you can just say that you accept the oath or that you do solemnly swear when I'm done, that would be great.
Okay.
The oath is I, Kara Woodruff, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
I agree.
Thank you so much. Okay, and then at this time too, I'd like to cover that public participation is in a couple different ways. Members of the public can watch this meeting live streamed on YouTube. If they prefer to call in, they can use the number on the screen, 669-900-6833, and use *9 to raise their hand when public comment is opened. They can view this meeting telephonically through Zoom using the meeting ID on the screen. And any written public comments that we received prior to 1 p.m. yesterday have been posted to the district's website and added to the administrative record for this meeting.
Okay, now we'll proceed along to approval of minutes. If the board members have reviewed the minutes provided by Alicia from the March 24th of 2021 and the September 28th of 2021 hearing board meetings.
Can we get a motion to approve both sets of those minutes?
I move that we approve those both of those sets of minutes.
We have a second?
A second.
Thank you. Are we ready for a roll call vote?
Yes, please.
Okay, Director Johnson,
Yes.
Director Anderson,
Yes.
Director Carr,
Yeah.
Director Lapidus,
Yes.
Director Woodruff.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Okay.
And now we'll go to the progress report on activities called out in stipulated order of abatement, case number 17-01 in the matter of California Department of Parks and Recreation, Off-Highway Motor Vehicle Recreation Division, Oceano Dunes State Recreation Area. And it looks like the first we're going to be having a presentation by Mr. Willie.
You're muted, Gary.
Good morning, Chair and hearing board members. Today, we're going to hear an update on the progress that we've made over the past year on stipulated order of abatement 17-01. And we're also using this as an opportunity to take public comment and get hearing board comment on this year's annual report and work plan. So today we'll have John O'Brien of State Parks. We'll go over their annual report and work plan, otherwise known as the ARWP. Raleigh Martin of the Scientific Advisory Group will go over their activities and why, and the rationale why they support the proposed 2021 ARWP. And finally, Carl Tupper will be giving the district's review of the air quality changes and our rationale for the provisional approval. That'll be followed by public comment and then the hearing board question and comments. Following this review and after considering public comment and hearing board comment, I have 7 days to approve the plan with or without additional conditions. So at that point, after this hearing, I can impose additional conditions needed, determined to be needed by the comments from this board and the public to address those, or I can approve it as is. So that's the process as it follows. And now I'm going to introduce John O'Brien of State Parks, and he'll go over their ARWP. John.
Thanks, Gary. Just a minute. Just going to do it this way. Got my speaker notes. Okay. Good morning again. I'm John O'Brien, and I'll be giving an overview of the Oceana Dunes SBRA DUS 2021 Annual Report and Work Plan, or the 2021 ARWP. Going to start with an overview of the annual report, part of the work plan, annual report and work plan, and that's the work completed in early 2021. Then I'll discuss the work plan portion, and that's work to be completed later in 2021 and 2022. I'll also highlight some of the ongoing research, discuss the track out plans, and then the educational or public relations campaign, PR campaign. So for the 2021 annual report, 92.3 acres of new dust mitigation projects were installed, mostly in the southern portion of the park. These projects consisted of wind fencing, straw treatments, sterile grass, and vehicle exclusions. In addition to these new projects, 32.3 acres of past projects were converted to native dune vegetation. As well, 40.3 acres of existing wind fencing were maintained. As a reference to those who may not be as familiar with the dunes and dust mitigation projects, here's an image of wind fencing on the dunes. And then here's an image of straw treatment at the dunes. All of these projects hinder sand movement across the dune surface, thereby reducing particulate matter or dust in the air. And here's an image, here's a map of the 92.3 acres of projects from earlier this year, along with the nature of the treatments. Again, these projects are in the southern part of the park and more influence the Mesa 2 air quality monitor. Excuse me. Previous year's projects were primarily in the northern part of the park. And here's a map of the entire park with the projects from earlier this year in darker green and the projects from prior years in lighter green. The 40 acres of wind fencing from previous projects are in orange. As of earlier this year, a total of 323 acres of dust mitigation projects have been installed, and this has resulted in a 22% reduction in mass emissions out of the 50% mass emission requirement as per the stipulated order of abatement 2C. Note that the mass emissions are modeled and reflect metric tons per year of emissions. This is different from the concentration measured at CDF and Mesa 2. The SOA calls for meeting the state and federal ambient air quality standards as well. These are concentration values. The PM10 concentration at CDF have been reduced by approximately 42%, and the PM10 concentration at Mesa 2 have been reduced by approximately 24%. Moving to the work plan portion of the ARWP, Parks plans to install 90 acres of new dust mitigation projects in late 2021 and early 2022. These projects will include sterile grass seed, straw treatments and other experimental dust control treatments to be decided in close coordination with the SAG and the APCD. Parks will also convert 53 acres of existing temporary dust control measures to native dune vegetation. In addition, there will be ongoing maintenance and monitoring, and an education or PR campaign will be initiated. In order to choose the location of the 2021 ARWP projects, Parks started by looking at the 2013 mass emission map on the left. These maps are from the Desert Research Institute, or DRI. The more emissive areas of the park based on the emissivity measurements by DRI are in red. However, looking at the 2019 map on the right, we can see that the more emissive areas of the map in 2013 are different from the emissive areas in 2019. This demonstrates the dynamic nature of the dunes. As per the stipulated order, we're required to use the 2013 mass emission map, but also wanted to take into account areas that would have the most impact on air quality downwind of ODS VRA. Given the dynamic nature of the dunes, the more emissive areas as per the 2013 mass emission map could be different from the areas that would most impact measured air quality downwind. So the goal, working with DRI and the scientific advisory group, was to find areas that would maximize impacts on both mass emissions and downwind air quality, all the while taking into account important travel corridors and public safety. So having gone through this process, the project locations of the 2021 ARWP are on this map in purple. Past projects are in light green. With the projects from the 2021 ARWP, there will be 412 acres of dust mitigation projects at ODS VRA. This will result in a 32% reduction in mass emissions out of the 50% mass emission requirement. This is up from 22% previously. The PM10 concentration reduction at CDF and Mesa 2 will be 47% and 33% respectively. This map from DRI shows the relative reduction in PM10 coming from the park. The cooler colors reflect higher reductions. The map on the left reflects the projects from earlier this year and before, and the map on the right reflects the upcoming projects along with all previous projects. There continues to be substantial research at ODS VRA focused on improving our understanding around dust and air quality at the park. DRI continues to research dust emissivity and concentrations. University of California, Santa Barbara and Arizona State University continue to monitor the Fording project in addition to the riding area-wide UAS or drone surveys. And Dr. Raleigh Martin from the SAG will talk more about that. And the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, along with a separate study by the APCD and the California Air Resources Board, continue to study the different components of particulate matter at ODS VRA. DRI produced 2 reports this past year, one outlining the progress that has been made toward achieving air quality objectives, and one looking at any impacts off-highway vehicle activity may have on dust emissivity. The latter report found that OHV activity increases the emissivity and dust levels in the active dune field, in addition to PM10 concentrations at ODS VRA. The former report, however, found that the dust mitigation measures in place have significantly improved air quality downwind of ODS VRA. The UC Santa Barbara and Arizona State University produced a 4-dune UAS or drone survey report. This looks at the dune development, sediment budget responses, and vegetation establishment. Again, Dr. Raleigh Martin from the SAG will speak further about this research. The Scripps Institute of Oceanography produced a second interim report earlier this year looking at the constituents of particulate matter at Oceana. The third interim report is currently under review and is expected to be released in the near future. Excuse me. The APCD, along with the California Air Resources Board, is also studying constituents of particulate matter at Oceana. Parks continues to maintain the track out mats at Pier and Grand Avenue during 2021. It's expected that the permanent track out structures may be installed as early as first quarter 2022, pending final funding approval. And then finally, as per the stipulated order, a public relations campaign related to air quality will be initiated in late 2021, 2022 in coordination with the SAG. That campaign is currently in process and will include a digital flyer, social media posts, an air quality video, and a document of frequently asked questions. And that concludes the State Park report for the 2021 ARWP.
So Gary, I think you're muted.
Thank you, John. Next up, we have Raleigh Martin of the Scientific Advisory Group. Raleigh, thank you.
Thanks so much. Good morning, Chair and Hearing Board. Just give me a second as I get my slides up. Okay, how does that look? Perfect.
Great, thank you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here on behalf of the Scientific Advisory Group. My name is Raleigh Martin. I'm acting as the chair of the SAG right now. But what I'm going to describe is the collective wisdom of all of the names listed here who are members of the SAG. So my presentation today is going to primarily cover the content of the ARWP, both the retrospective of the annual report and the prospective of the work plan, with some emphasis on the ongoing dune restoration activities and progress on PM10 emissions reductions and concentration reductions. And then I'll also provide some additional emphasis on recent studies regarding dust sources and vehicular impacts of the dunes, ongoing work to revisit the target for emissions reductions under the stipulated order of abatement, and other updates from the SAG. So with respect to the annual report portion of the ARWP, the retrospective of the previous year, overall, the SAG is pleased with the progress that's reported here. And in particular, we appreciate that the development of this annual report and work plan and the activities over the last year have had increasing cooperative engagement among the SAG, Parks, and APCD. We also, as a SAG, recognize the scale of efforts required by Parks to achieve the goals under the particulate matter reduction plan, growing plants, installing dust controls, and all of the ongoing monitoring and modeling. And as I'll emphasize here today, the dust control activities, so those activities thus far are shown in this figure here, have led to demonstrable progress in reducing both PM10 emissions, that is the PM10 that's generated from the ODSVRA surfaces, as well as the downwind concentrations of airborne PM10 at the receptor sites of CDF and MESA 2. So then looking forward to the work plan portion of the ARWP, the SAG is again in approval of this. We think that the proposed 90 acres of treatments appropriately balance reductions both in the PM10 mass emissions, including being cognizant of the changing nature of where the most emissive surfaces are based on recent PI-swirl studies, and also reductions of PM10 concentrations at the CDF and MESA 2 receptor sites. One thing to note as well, these new treatments now form a continuous line along the eastern boundary of the ODSVRA. So not only does this distribute the air quality improvements throughout the downwind catchment area, but it also potentially, by creating a line of treatments, could have indirect benefits in terms of reduction of dust emissions downwind of those treatments as well. We do state that we prefer established restoration approaches. This is native vegetation and temporary treatments like wind fences and the straw treatments. We're not opposed to the use of soil stabilizers that's proposed, but these need to be proven effective before they're used in a widespread manner. The continuing work on temporary treatments being converted to native dune vegetation will provide long-term sustainability. So we're approving of that. And we also approve of the continuing monitoring and modeling efforts to inform adaptive management. So Now I'm going to spend a few slides talking about the progress of dune restoration treatments. The focus is on the previous year and the upcoming year, but I'm also going to put in context what has been happening in the prior years. So you can see here in this figure, since 2019, there has been a steadily increasing acreage under treatment. The goal that was originally set forth in the particulate matter reduction plan is 500 acres. Potentially that number will need to change, but we can see based on that existing target that we are steadily moving in that direction. With the predominant treatments being in the back dune areas within the riding area, which makes sense because those are the most emissive surfaces. Some of these numbers were in John's presentation, but in 2020, there was over 90 acres of new treatments, as well as over 30 acres of conversion of temporary treatments to native dune vegetation. That progress continues in 2021 through 2022. There's impressive seed harvest and plant cultivation activities taking place. You can see some of these numbers. We have hundreds of kilograms of native seed harvest per year and hundreds of thousands of plants being cultivated over this time period, and continuing efforts on monitoring and modeling of the effectiveness of these dust control efforts. One of the foci of the particulate matter reduction plan and the SAG's efforts has been the restoration of the foredunes. Though small, relatively speaking, in area, 48 acres, we believe that these foredunes will have a disproportionate impact because they are in the most emissive parts of the ODSVRA, and furthermore, they will have potential downwind benefits beyond just the immediate footprint of these foredunes. So for context, the 48-acre foredunes were installed in February of 2020, subdivided into 6 treatment areas. I'm not going to get into the details here, and we do have Dr. Ian Walker online to answer questions about this. He's the real expert here. But one thing to keep in mind is that the general progression of treatments from north to south is that the northernmost treatments are the least intensive amount of intervention. And then going from north to south, there's increasing amount of, for example, vegetation that is planted to try to foster the development of these foredunes. The goals here are both PM10 dust emissions reduction and developing a healthy and dynamic foredune. And the reason for this is because we not only want to reduce PM10 dust emissions now, clearly that's important, but we also want these foredunes to be sustained in the long term so they can continue to provide benefit for years to come. And so to understand the development of these foredunes, we have an intensive monitoring campaign that includes meteorology, sand flux measurements, vegetation surveys, and these semi-annual UAS drone surveys of surface change. So to give you a sense of what we're working toward, here are a couple of reference sites that are helping to inform what a mature foredune would look like. One is the Oso Flaco site and the southern portion of the ODSVRA. And the second is the seasonal plover exclosure in the southern portion of the riding area. And so you can see, generally speaking, these areas are pretty well vegetated, but not 100% vegetated. There are sand tracks that help to maintain a dynamic environment in these partially vegetated zones. So one element of the current ARWP is the UC Santa Barbara, Arizona State Foredune Restoration Survey Report. This is based on a variety of data sources, which include these repeat UAS flights, which are done semi-annually. And the report highlights 5 criteria by which these 6 treatments are being judged for their success. And I'll briefly go through these. First is the ability to maintain positive sediment budget, that basically capturing and catching sand. Secondly is maintaining aeolian activity, so ensuring that there is still some sand flux that's moving through. Third is ensuring plant survivorship and increased plant cover over time. Fourth is enhancing dune development, particularly Nebca dunes, these kind of vegetation hummocks that grow within the foredune zone. And then fifth, of course, is reducing dust emissivity. So I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just wanted to say that along all of these dimensions, there are varying levels of progress across the 640 and treatment areas. There's not one clear winner that's emerging. So for example, we see very large NEBCAs forming in treatments 3 and 5, but we also see differential sediment budgets and alien activity. And so basically the position of the SAG here is that we need to continue to monitor these 6 treatments before kind of putting all of our eggs in one basket of a particular treatment area approach. So to kind of show this visually, these are photos looking toward the beach of these 640 and restoration treatments. And you can see in all cases, there is significant dune development, there is significant alien transport that's occurring, and there is, with the exception of treatment 1, where no seed or vegetation was put in place, significant vegetation cover that is growing in place. So now I'm going to talk a bit about progress on air quality. And I wanted to emphasize, I know this point has been brought up before, but there are multiple ways in which we're looking at this, which I think establish a lot of confidence for the SAG that we're really making progress. So first, I just want to reiterate there are 2 different indicators we use for air quality progress. One is mass emissions. It's the amount of PM10 that's being generated directly from the surface of the ODS VRA. And secondly is the airborne concentration of PM10 that's measured at the receptor sites of CDF and MESA 2 downwind. In addition, we have 2 modes of examination. One is through use of the DRI model. The advantage of this is we have a standardized scenario that's based on the top 10 baseline days from 2013. But we also have direct measurements which look at the actual changes in PM10 concentrations at the receptor sites relative to the occurrence of wind events. So looking through these various lines of evidence, the first piece of evidence that gives us progress of air quality progress is looking at modeled PM10 mass emissions across the riding area of the ODS VRA. We can see prior to the SOA, roughly 180 metric tons per day of PM10 mass emissions within the riding area. And this has been on steady decline toward this goal that is currently in SOA of reducing mass emissions by 50% relative to the pre-SOA 2013 baseline condition. Now, if we look at this instead in terms of air quality, these are modeled PM10 concentrations at the receptor sites. The story is a little bit more complicated, and the reason is that changes in concentrations are going to depend on where in particular the treatments are placed within the ODS VRA. So what you can see here, the blue symbols are CDF, the brown squares are MESA 2. Prior to the restoration activities, CDF had worse air quality than MESA 2, at least in terms of PM10. The initial treatments were placed upwind of primarily the CDF sites. You see more dramatic declines in mass concentrations of CDF over those first 2 years. But then in the prior year up to the present, there's been an emphasis on mitigations upwind of MESA 2. And so now you see MESA 2 and CDF achieving rough parity in 2021, and this progress will continue in 2022. And for reference, the line here across this graph is the California state standard of 50 micrograms per cubic meter. So we're definitely, seeing dramatic progress toward that goal, although we're not there yet, even with the treatments in 2022. So we've looked at model. Now looking at direct measurements, we can also see lines of evidence for progress. The first is derived from an approach that the APCD has taken, which is basically to look at variation in high wind events per year, and then comparing that to variation in exceedances of the California air quality standard per year. The reason for looking at it this way is that, for example, in 2019, there were fewer high wind events, and therefore, not surprisingly, there were fewer California exceedance events. But the critical thing to note here, which is encouraging, is in 2013, prior to the SOA, in particular at the CDF receptor site, you can see that the number of California exceedance events was pretty much equivalent to the number of high wind event days. Basically, every time the wind blew strongly, you had an exceedance to the California standard. As we get into 2020 and 2021, which were both relatively windy years, we now see quite a divergence, roughly 50 to 60 high wind event days, but only 30 to 40 exceedance days. So this is a positive sign that these mitigation treatments are positively affecting air quality. And then finally, this was a study that was referenced by John in his presentation from Parks. This recent study was conducted by the Desert Research Institute, Dr. Jack Gillies, looking at these two quantities. Total PM10 concentration is basically a time averaged value of PM10 during high wind events. And then this quantity called total wind power density, which is a proxy for the accumulated sum of strong wind events over these relative periods. And basically, this plot is showing the change in this ratio of PM10 to wind power density over time. And what you see is that over time, the ratio of these values is decreasing. So for the same wind power density, you now get a significantly less weaker PM10 signal. And so this is yet another encouraging line of evidence that these dust mitigation treatments are working. One thing we will note, there was another study that was performed by the California Geological Survey that had a different finding of this DRI report, and that's the methodology of that California Geological Survey study is one that we as a SAG dispute, and you can see our reasoning in this attachment to the ARWP. So in summary, regarding the ARWP, we see solid and steady progress in backdune and foredune restoration. We need to continue monitoring the foredune treatment alternatives, and we need to, before really going in on soil stabilizers, prove that they're effective. We see from multiple lines of evidence, steady progress in reducing both PM10 mass emissions and concentrations, but we still have a ways to go. And I also just wanted to highlight a couple of things that we commented on as a SAG with the ARWP. We encourage parks to begin planning what dust control efforts will look like in a world without OHVs, given the recent Coastal Commission decision. And we would really encourage parks to prioritize their efforts on the PR campaign in the coming year. So now I'm going to just cover a few topics in a bit of depth. The dust sources and impacts of OHV, revisiting the SOA target and plans of the SAG. So with respect to dust sources and vehicular impacts, there are a few studies that are informing our thinking on this. The first study, which I'm not really going to talk about because new results are in progress, is the SCRIPT study, which is looking to examine sources of airborne particles in the Oceanic area via filter sampling. The second, which is also ongoing, is the speciation study being undertaken by CARB and APCD, taking samples every few days to inform this technique called positive matrix factorization, which can hopefully disentangle the various sources of dust that are present at the CDF site. And then finally, which I'm going to talk a bit more about, so pretty much every year since 2013, Desert Research Institute has conducted repeat sampling using this instrument called the PI-Swirl, which measures the emissivity of surfaces throughout the ODS VRA, both within riding areas and outside riding areas. And based in part on this PI-Swirl sampling, as well as air quality measurements, DRI produced this report examining dust emissions and OHV activity at the ODS VRA. So there were three key findings of this report. The first finding, which is highlighted in this figure, is that riding areas are significantly more emissive of non-riding areas with respect to PM10. So the way that the PI-Swirl works is that it generates a certain wind speed, which is represented by this value U star on the x-axis of this figure. And it looks at the amount of emissivity of dust that occurs for that wind speed. And what you can see is for non-riding areas, there is dust emitted with the PI-Swirl, and it increases as the wind speed increases, but it remains at relatively low levels. Whereas for the riding areas, the same wind speed will produce significantly more PM10 for that particular wind speed. And so this is pretty unambiguous evidence that the fact that we have intensive vehicular use on the riding areas of the dunes makes these surfaces more emissive. and therefore contributes significantly to the air quality problem. In addition to other notable findings of the GRI report, it looked at the closure of the dunes last year due to COVID-19 and found that surfaces within the riding area became significantly less emissive than they were in previous years, indicating the fact that these surfaces potentially were restoring to a less emissive state when they were not being impacted by OHVs. And furthermore, through 2020, there was a decline over time in airborne PM10 concentrations relative to wind strength, which is contrary to the predominant case of increasing PM10 concentrations through the windy season. So these are all lines of evidence that both long-term and during the COVID closure, the presence of OHVs at the ODS VRA significantly affects PM10 in the air column. The one thing I will note, though, is that though these studies provide compelling evidence of vehicular impacts, we would urge caution in interpreting specific percentage changes in emissivity or concentrations because there are other factors such as soil moisture that complicate a simple comparison. Okay, so another topic to discuss is the approach to the SOA target. So currently the stipulated order of abatement says that the goal is to reduce PM10 emissions for these top 10 baseline days by 50% relative to the scenario of 2013. That's kind of what we're all operating toward at the current moment. However, the SOA also grants some discretion to modify this approach based on modeling conducted by CARB or in consultation with the SAG. And so we have been thinking about the SOA target and whether it is appropriate. And a couple of considerations here. First, we all agree that the dunes are a naturally emissive environment. We're never going to get PM10 emissions to zero. It's just the nature of the beast. But we do see this clear evidence that there is a significant amplification of PM10 emissions at the ODS VRA relative to a state that would have existed prior to this vehicular disturbance. And the question is really, is 50% reduction an appropriate way to model the difference between pre-disturbance and post-disturbance, or should the target be something other than that current 50%? So there are a few considerations here as we revisit the SOA target. And I illustrate this by looking at this diagram that shows our progress in terms of reducing PM10 emissions relative to this current 50% reduction target. So the first thing is simply, is 50% reduction appropriate? Should we be aiming for this roughly 90 metric tons per day for the 10 baseline days, or should that number be something else? And so the way we're approaching this is we are modeling a scenario of what would the emissions look like prior to OHV disturbance. So for example, modeling the amount of vegetation that existed on the dunes prior to disturbance and the emissivity of the surfaces. As you'll recall, non-riding areas are significantly less emissive than riding areas. We've already, with the Desert Research Institute, conducted preliminary modeling that this approach is feasible to revisiting the SOA target, but we're waiting further refined information, for example, on historical vegetation cover, before we move forward on more specifically revisiting this target. In addition, we would like to revisit the way in which we're accounting for PM10 mass emissions reductions so that they are appropriately credited. Currently, only those emissions reductions that are directly within treatment areas are being accounted for, but potentially we see that there are also additional emissions reductions that occur downwind of treatments, especially the fording restoration zone. And so we're currently working on approaches such as computational fluid dynamics modeling that would more appropriately account for how we're looking at these reductions in emissions over time. And so finally, once we have a new sense of an SOA target, we have a new sense of how to account for emissions reductions, that would then inform potentially looking at this goal of what is the total number of acreage that is needed. The PMRP says 500 acres. The sensitivity analysis that was included in the most recent ARWP revises that target and says roughly 600 acres. But I think the actual goal will depend on how all of these factors come together, and we'll continue to work on this in the coming months. Finally, I wanted to just give a brief update on what the SAG has been doing. we have been greatly appreciating the leadership of Dr. Bill Nickling of the SAG over the past few years. However, Dr. Nickling has needed to step aside in recent months, so I have been taking on the role of the acting chair of the SAG. The SAG, it seems like we're meeting more and more frequently as more and more information is coming forward from all this monitoring and modeling work. So we've had frequent meetings and calls. We were able to meet in person in July 2021, and I'm hoping we'll have another in-person meeting in early 2022. A major activity for us in the coming months will be this process of revisiting the target for the stipulated order of abatement, hopefully with refined model results available in early 2022. And finally, I'll just note that we continue to fulfill our independent advisory role. We've been working with Parks on standardizing a process for scientific peer review of new studies. We're working on developing the synthesis report called State of the Science that will look at all of the many existing studies that are out there and try to hopefully put them all in context in one place so people can understand them better. And we'll continue to coordinate with Parks and APCD on adaptive management. So in closing, some takeaways here. We are overall in support of the ARWP. We see continuing progress on air quality, but we're not there yet. I think recent studies have shown unambiguously the impacts that vehicles have on PM10 emissions, but some of these ongoing studies will help to refine our understanding of that. A big goal in the coming months is this process to revisit the SOA target and determine whether the current 50% mass emissions reduction goal is appropriate. And then finally, we are going to continue to be an independent scientific advisory group to help inform this process and move it along. So with that, I'll turn it back to the chair for the next presentation.
Okay, the next presentation will be back with, I assume, Mr. Woolley.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Martin, for the excellent presentation. Appreciate the work of the SAG. This has been a very long and difficult process, but the progress that we've made is directly a result of the scientific advisory group. Done tremendous work out there, and really a credit to the way this order was set up, that we're working through a very difficult environment and getting it done. With that, we'll have Carl Tupper give the APCD's review of the AWRP and the progress that we've made so far. Carl?
Thanks, Gary. Okay, everyone should be able to see my screen. Let me know if you can't. So thanks for the opportunity to present to the hearing board this morning and to the public. It's always, I always appreciate these opportunities. So today I'm going to talk about our analysis of the effects of the dust control projects on PM10 downwind. And a lot of the slides I'm going to show are going to look familiar because I've given versions of this presentation in the past, previous hearing board meetings, and now I'm just kind of updating things to show, the latest, to bring 2021 on board and show how 2021 so far compares to previous years. And then I'm going to shift gears and talk about why we, the APCD, feel that this ARWP is a good plan, and we have provisionally approved it. So just a reminder, I'm going to be talking about air quality results, air quality monitoring that was done downwind of the Oceano Dunes. So we have CDF is the main site that I'm going to talk about. It is downwind, directly downwind of the riding area of the dunes, which is shown outlined by these green dashes here. I'll also mention Mesa 2, which is a little bit further away and is downwind of both riding and, to a lesser extent, non-riding areas. And then I'll mention the Oso Flaco monitoring site, which is actually within the Oceano Dunes, but downwind of non-riding areas. So the PM10 that we measure at these sites comes from a variety of sources. There's the usual sources that we see all over the place, wherever we monitor for PM10, like atmospheric aerosols, traffic influences, and on these coastal sites, we can frequently see the influence of sea salt. And then all these sites are influenced by wildfire smoke. Particularly last year, we saw some really high levels of wildfire smoke across the county and including at these sites. We also saw some impacts in 2017. And then occasionally we get regional dust impacts. So in the San Joaquin Valley, there can be these huge dust storms, and some of that dust gets transported into our county, and we measure it at these sites in Nipomo and also all across the county. So all of those things are impacting these sites. But in addition to that, we have windblown dust from the Oceano dunes. And the amount of windblown dust that we get from one year to the next can be influenced by a number of things. There's the dust control projects that are being put out there as a result of this process. And of course, there's winds. We don't see the dust without high winds. Some years are windier than other years, so we expect to see higher levels of dust in windy years. And then, of course, last year, the dunes were closed to vehicular activity for much of the year, and so that may have had an influence. And so teasing these two things out, the influence of the dust controls and the influence of the closure to vehicular activity, that's a difficult thing. And I'm going to talk about how we're doing that and what those results are. And I also really quickly want to go over the history of dust controls out there and how these projects have evolved over time. And so I really want to say thanks to State Parks for including this appendix in the annual report and work plan, which shows from year to year the changes in dust control projects. And so I'm just going to step through that. So 2015, there were 71 acres out there. You can see there's a big wind fence project labeled number 7. And then outside of the riding area, there were some vegetation projects. 2016, the area increased. 2017, we lost some area, only 53 acres. And that's when we initiated the stipulated order of abatement process. So late 2017, we petitioned the hearing board and we started down that road. 2018, the SOA was signed, and as a result of that, you can see there was a big increase in dust controls on the dune. So we went from about 53 acres to 147 acres, and you can see those projects kind of in the middle of the park there. 2019, we actually went backwards. We lost a few acres, and so then we went back to the hearing board. We've modified the stipulated order, and that required parks to do certain things. And so that happened in 2020. We see a big increase in acreage. Another 90 acres of dust controls were put in. The 4 dune projects were put in, as you can see there, and some other smaller areas were put in as well. Last year, or I should say, earlier this year, another 90 acres went in. These focused down more upwind of the Mesa 2 site. And as we sit here today, there are approximately 322 acres of dust controls within the ODSVRA. And the plan, as has been mentioned by John and Raleigh, is to do another 90 acres that would go in starting late this year, early 2022, and it would look like what you see here. So how has PM10 responded to these dust controls at CDF downwind? So on the right, that is the same graph we saw before. It just plots the cumulative acreage of dust controls within the Oceano dunes. And on the left here, we see the number of hours at CDF with really high PM10 levels. So PM10 levels of over 300 micrograms per cubic meter, which is really quite extreme. And for all of these years, we're just looking at the period from January 1st to October 11th. Okay, so we can compare apples to apples, because we don't, for 2021, of course, we only have data from January 1st until mid-October. So 2015, 2016, 2017, before the stipulated order of abatement, we only had between 55 and 75 acres of dust controls, and we were seeing between 70 and almost 100 hours each year where PM10 had these really extreme levels, over 300. 2018, there was this big jump in dust controls, and at the same time, a big jump down in the number of hours over 300. 2019 looks a lot like 2018, both in terms of hours over 300 and cumulative dust control. 2020, we saw a huge drop off in these extreme hours, number of hours over 300. And that could be because there were 90 more acres out there, or it could be because there was no riding for much of the year, or it could also simply be maybe it was not a very windy year. But at any rate, in 2020, we saw a huge drop off, and I'll return to that. But just based on looking at this, we saw very few hours in 2020 of extreme PM10 levels. And then this year, with riding back happening, we see 22 hours so far this year, which is still a lot less than we saw in every previous year besides last year. So anyways, I think the takeaway here is that we're seeing progress. We're seeing fewer and fewer hours of extreme PM10 levels as we increase the extent of mitigations. But what about 2020? Maybe it just wasn't that windy that year. Maybe that's why there were so few exceedances. Or maybe it was because of this closure due to COVID-19. So we can look at this problem a different way. We can look at the number of wind events each year, and a wind event is defined, as you can see here, but basically really strong winds in the afternoon out of a certain direction, kind of out of the northwest. And we can look at the number of wind events each year, and that's what you see on the graph on the right here. So it's pretty constant, 2015, 2016, 2017. And I would argue this year, we see, upper 50s, maybe 60 wind events per year. 2019 was actually a particularly calm year. And then last year was actually quite windy. So what we saw in this previous slide, where we see so few extreme hours at CDF, only 3 hours above 300. I don't think we can say it was because it was a calm year, because in fact, 2020 had a higher frequency of wind events than any of these other years. And so then we can look at the number of exceedances of the state PM10 standard. So that's a 24-hour average over 50. And what you can see is that in the pre-SOA years, 2015, 16, and 17, the number of exceedances tracks the number of wind events. And Raleigh showed a slide very similar to this in his presentation. And then as we get into the SOA, 2018, 2019, and 2021, you can see this gap between the number of wind events and the number of exceedances widens. And now we also see exceedances, particularly in 2020, due to other influences, wildfire smoke in San Joaquin Valley, dust transport. So if we take those out, it looks like this. And so, we still see a big gap between the two, although the gap in 2020 widens because, again, there was some fire influences in 2020. So we can also look at Mesa 2. So through 2020, the dust controls were focused upwind of CDF, as you can see here where I've overlaid one of those maps I showed earlier. And then in 2021, the dust controls that went in this year were shifted further south to try to target Mesa 2 a little bit more, as you can see here. And so what effect did that have? Well, on the top, I'm showing the number of hours at CDF again, same plot we showed earlier. And now below here, I'm looking at the number of extreme hours at Mesa 2. And what you can see is a steadily decline from year to year to year, although the gains have not been as much as at CDF as you would expect, because for the most part, the controls were targeted upwind of CDF. And then looking at wind events versus the number of standard exceedances at Mesa 2, there's always been a lot fewer at Mesa 2 than at CDF. And when we take out the influence of fires and San Joaquin Valley dust, it kind of looks like maybe that gap is widening as we get further in time, but it's a little bit less apparent than at CDF. And so now I'm gonna look at this a third way, a more quantitative way than just looking at some graphs. And this comes down to comparing Oso Flaco and CDF. And the key insight is that these sites experience the same meteorology, but only CDF is impacted by the mitigations. So, if it's a windy day, it's windy up and down the coast. It's going to be a windy day at Oso Flaco, and it's going to be a windy day at CDF. And if it's, wet, if it's moist, if it's rainy, if there's a lot of fog, it's going to be the same. It's going to have the same influence on both sites. So annual trends in meteorology should affect the PM10 that we measure similarly at CDF and at Oso Flaco. If it's a really windy year, it's going to be a really windy year at both sites. Okay. Similarly, wildfires and other non-ODSVRA sources should have similar effects on both sites. The smoke impacts that we see across the county, really, not just at CDF or Oso Flaco. So these sites have the same meteorology, are influenced similarly by non-ODSVRA sources, but the mitigations are mostly upwind of CDF and not at all upwind of Oso Flaco. So changes in mitigation should really only affect CDF. So what this suggests is using Oso Flaco as a control site and looking at the ratio of PM10 at Oso Flaco or the ratio of PM10 at CDF to Oso Flaco during wind events and seeing how that ratio changes from year to year. So on this slide, I'm looking at 2017 and 2018. So as you can see on the right, the extent of mitigations went from 53 acres to 149 or 147 acres. But on this top graph here, this is a histogram of those CDF to Oso Flaco ratios on wind event days in 2017. And on the bottom is the same histogram, but for 2018. And what you can hopefully see is that the histogram has shifted shifted towards lower values as we go from 2017 to 2018. In other words, as we go from 2017 to 2018, that ratio decreased, as you would hope. And so now I'm going to look at that same data just displayed a little bit differently in this box plot here, where we're looking at the distribution kind of on its side. And you can do some statistical tests, and what you find out is there was a 16% decrease going from 2017 to 2018. And that is barely statistically significant. 2019, we lost a little bit of acreage, and the ratio looks about the same between 2017 and 2019. But last year, 2020, with 230 acres out there, that ratio in event day PM10 decreased by 23% versus 2017, and that was statistically significant. And now if we look at this year, that ratio has decreased again, and now we're seeing 27% decrease versus the baseline of 2017. And again, it's statistically significant. So the takeaways are, we see continued improvement in wind event day PM10 at CDF versus pre-SOA conditions. 2021 saw a 27% decrease. That's statistically significant. 27% decrease in event day PM10. And I believe that this improvement will likely be even larger once the entire year is included. So we're just looking at, as I said, that period between between January 1st and October 11th, because obviously 2021 is not over yet. If you look at last year, 2020, January through mid-October, there's a 23% decrease. But if you consider all of last year, there was a 28% decrease. And this is the number I cited in my March presentation. Point being, there's a lot of wind events to come probably. October tends to be very windy. So once we have the whole year's worth of data, I expect that we'll see an even greater decrease than 27%. So in summary, there are multiple factors that affect the trends in PM10 downwind of the dunes. There's the dust controls. Where are they? How much are they? Exactly when did they go in? There's meteorology, in particular the frequency and intensity of high wind events. And of course, there's impacts of other sources like wildfires and regional dust. So it's a complicated picture, but nonetheless, various lines of analysis, various ways of looking at the problem from different angles all show significant, measurable year-over-year improvements in PM10 levels at CDF. And because of the way some of these analyses are set up, we feel confident that we can attribute those changes to the dust controls that were implemented under the SOA. And then we see lesser impacts at Mesa 2, but we do see some impacts there as well. So now I want to shift gears and talk about our provisional approval of the annual report and work plan. So on the right here, this is a graphic we've seen a couple times now this morning, but this is what the dust controls will look like if and after the proposed 2022 dust controls are implemented. So just to kind of to rewind, do some background, the stipulated order of abatement has a goal of achieving the PM10 standards downwind of the dunes. And to achieve that goal, it sets an initial target of a 50% reduction in emissions. And the timeline is this is supposed to happen by the end of 2023. So the stipulated order of abatement directed state parks to develop a PMRP, a particulate matter reduction plan, which demonstrates how to get to this target of a 50% reduction. And the PMRP modeled a scenario that showed that 501 acres would be needed to meet this target and achieve the PM10 standards. And I'll return to that target because the new ARWP changes that a little bit, refines that a little bit. But anyways, 501 acres has been the goal that we have been aiming at as a result of that. So as of 2021, as of right now, there are 322 acres of dust controls, which means we've got 2 years to complete an additional 180 acres to get to 501. And so that comes out to about 90 acres per year. And the ARWP proposes 90 new acres of dust controls. And it also talks about converting 53 acres of temporary controls to permanent vegetation. And that really is the crux of why we feel that this annual report and work plan is provisionally approvable. The work plan also talks about some other things. So unfortunately, last year's dust controls were delayed a little bit in their implementation. And that had to do with some issues with permitting with the Coastal Commission, and then also snowy plovers, this endangered species, kind of nesting in areas, and then parks not being able to work in those areas because of the snowy plovers. So this annual report and work plan includes some explicit measures, or it includes some measures to avoid those delays, like explicit coordination with the Coastal Commission and some timing of work to avoid the plover nesting season. As Raleigh mentioned in his presentation and John alluded to in his, the ARWP also discloses these DRI studies of the temporary closures and the effects that had on dust emissions. And the takeaway message here is that simply eliminating vehicles from the dunes reduced emissivity by about 50% after about 6 months, which we think is a significant result. And so finally, the ARWP has this new compliance scenario. So a new scenario, what is it going to take to meet the goals of the stipulated order of abatement? So as I mentioned earlier, the PMRP estimated it would take 501 acres of dust controls, but the new modeling suggests it's going to take 602. So first of all, why is there this difference? Basically this is a dynamic situation and we're always incorporating new information, but also the scenario that was modeled in the PMRP looked like this. So they had these big polygons, big areas of where they were gonna, that scenario hypothesized removing or completely controlling and bringing emissions down to zero. But that, of course, is not what has been implemented so far. This is what it will look like after implementing these proposed controls. So there's a difference between what was modeled in the PMRP and what was actually installed out there on the dunes. And that is partially responsible or mostly responsible for why this estimate has increased so much. And then this is buried in an appendix, and I'm sorry for the quality of this graphic, but this is basically what that 602 acre scenario would look like for dust controls. And so if you're following along, if you're doing the math, what that means is that next year, in order to get to this 602 acres, parks would need to install 190 acres of dust controls, which is a lot. However, we feel that this is probably doable for a number of reasons. First of all, 190 acres or 602 total acres is just an estimate. There's more modeling to be done, including something that Raleigh mentioned, which is the computational fluid dynamics modeling, which should capture some additional effects that are not currently captured in the modeling. So I think once that CFD, that computational fluid dynamics modeling is incorporated, it's probably going to bring that estimate down from 602 acres a little bit. And then a second thing is this year Parks is doing 90 new acres plus 53 acres of converting existing controls to vegetation. So that's 143 acres of dust controls that Parks is really undertaking this year. So that's a lot. That gets us pretty close to 190. And then finally, something the district has always believed, and I think this DRI study really shows quite clearly, is that a simple vehicle exclosure, eliminating vehicles, can dramatically reduce dust emissions as well. And so between 140 acres of controls on the ground and then some additional vehicle exclosures, I believe we can, achieving the goals of the SOA is within reach by the end of 2023. And so with that, I will stop talking. This is my contact information. And for the benefit of the hearing board members and also the public, I just want to point out that there's a wealth of ODSVRA related materials on our website at this web address. And then also there's a bunch of hearing board related materials at this other URL here. And at that, I will hand it back to the chair. Thank you for your attention.
Mr. Chair, you're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Carl. That was an excellent presentation. It was pointed out by Board Member Anderson that just a slight change on your slides need to be made that should refer to the 2021 work plan.
Yeah, that's correct. I looked at those slides a million times and didn't see that. And then as I was talking, I noticed that it said that. That's how it goes sometimes. Thanks for pointing that out.
And thank you, Mr. Anderson. Anyhow, at this point, Gary, do you have anything else to add at this point, or?
Yeah, I would like to add just a little bit to put this in context. We're excited about the progress. It's been a long haul, and we have a lot of momentum right now. We're really getting a lot of good work done. It's disappointing that we haven't met the targets yet and gotten closer, but we are rapidly getting there. And it's just been 2 years since we refined the order and really started making really significant buildable reductions. We're building an ecosystem here that's going to work whether or not there's riding on the dunes. This is an extremely difficult thing to do because it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. You control something over here, you shift patterns over there. So it's really exciting that we're making progress. We are disappointed that we're not there yet, and we're continuing to strive towards doing that. And I'd like to point out that we need to think about modifying this order in March to take care of a number of different things, including life after if the park closes down, and maybe some continuing jurisdiction type things with the hearing board. So I'll talk about that more later. With that, we're ready to go to accept public comment on this item.
Okay. Thank you. Alicia, do we have any members of the public who wish to comment at this time?
Yeah, I think, Mr. Chair, at this point, we should give the members of the public a few minutes or a minute or so to raise their hands, make sure that they know if there's any callers on the phone. That public comment is now open. So if you wish to speak on this particular item, please raise your hand and I will call you in order. We do have a few members of the public that wish to speak. The first member of the public is going to be Rochelle Tody. And just real quick before we get to that, I do want to administer the oath. So any members of the public that wish to speak, please accept the oath before you speak and also state your first and last name. The oath is, do you solemnly state under penalty of perjury that the evidence that you shall give in this matter shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So please, before you make your comments, give your first and last name, state that you accept the oath, and then proceed with your comments. Members of the public are going to be limited to 2 minutes for their public comments, and there will be a timer on the screen for that. And then without further ado, let me get this on the screen. Rochelle Tody is the first to speak. You may unmute yourself and accept the oath, please, Ms. Tody.
Hello, Rochelle Tody. I accept the oath.
Thank you.
I would like to thank all of the presenters today because the information that you presented was very informative. And I agree that progress has been made in reducing the dust emissions at CDF and to a smaller degree at Mesa too. However, we are nowhere near getting to the state standard in exceedances. And for example, over the last 6 days, CDF has had 4 state exceedances and Oso Flaco had 1. So we should be trying to get closer to the state standard. I've continually pointed out that the mitigation needs to address the wide plume that covers the Nipomo Mesa and its residents. Managing to reduce readings in a narrow band leading to CDF is not what's required. And so I was glad to see in one of those slides that the band seems to be getting wider. But again, this is happening at a snail's pace. Nipomo has been in the highest 10 on the US EPA website, probably over 30 days this year. CDF is roughly 5 times the state exceedances that Oso Flaco has. I was glad to hear in Carl Tupper's presentation that the vehicle exclusion that occurred in 2020 clearly demonstrates that that is one way to address the air pollution. And so I would recommend that just fencing off larger areas to decrease the disturbance of the dune surface is something that should be done for 2022. And this would also be targeted for the most emissive areas to vehicles. So if you closed that off, you could probably reach 140 acres closed with no problem. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Tody. Okay. Give me 1 second. The next member of the public to speak is going to be Chris Sorensen. Please give the oath prior to speaking, and you may unmute yourself and speak.
I am Chris Sorensen, and I accept the oath.
Thank you.
Like Rochelle, I do compliment the team for the excellent report today. It really clarified a lot for me. I'm still left with a few questions. First of all, I think a lot of what's being projected here is based on modeling. The modeling, of course, is based upon some assumptions around the effectiveness of the controls that are being installed. A lot of it depends on vegetation, and there's a timeline between now planting and when the vegetation actually has effect. So I'm not sure how that factors into these projections. My concern is that are these projections for how things will be when they're mature or how they'll be at the end of 2023? That's not clear to me. Also, delaying 190 acres to the last year of controls before the end of the SOA term seems a little risky to me. Why not put those 190 acres into this year? And that'll get us closer, and it won't be less of a panic last year, and we'll see vegetation. If it's possible to do more vegetation this year, then maybe that's what we should be doing. I agree with Rochelle. Just simply closing more acres off to writing would certainly be a benefit in the short term. We have to keep in mind that this is a marvelous scientific investigation, and the work that's being done in that area is very amazing, and in my opinion, is great. A lot of thanks to the SAG for all of their effort, these studies they've been doing, and to state parks for exposing all of this to the public so we can see what's going on. Compliments to everybody there. But we got to remember this is a public health issue, and I still don't see that level of urgency that would require for us to get to this goal sooner rather than later. Just pushing for 500 acres by the end of next 2023 doesn't seem to be enough. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Okay. The next member of the public that will speak is Tom Ryan. You can please accept the oath and unmute yourself to speak, or unmute yourself to speak and then accept the oath.
Yes, this is Tom Ryan. I accept the oath. I just wanted to say briefly, I did send in a letter with a lot of information, but given the time limits, I will say that we can all agree that the excessive levels of air pollution off the dunes is extremely unhealthy for the residents of the Nipomo Mesa. And I really, again, question why State Parks is waiting to the last minute to reach that 50% goal, given the health effects on California residents. Why wait to the last minute? Why don't they let them live a little longer? And what will occur if State Parks fails to meet to the 50% goal? I mean, the question is, are they going to give millions of dollars to the residents and say, sorry, we didn't make it? Or are they just going to say, oops, let's try again? It seems that they're not trying hard enough. And I do understand the question that the Scientific Advisory Group put out, saying maybe the reduction of 50% is not enough. And I think maybe the reduction needs to be maybe 70%, a little more. And in closing, I will say it appears we have triers, not doers. I would say if the state park leaders who are in charge of the mitigation were generals in World War II, we'd all be speaking German now. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Okay. The next member of the public to speak is going to be Arlene Bursaw. Arlene, you may unmute yourself.
Good morning. I do accept the oath. My name is Arlene Bursaw, and I raised my hand to speak before the prior speakers did, and they pretty much have covered what I wanted to say, so I won't spend a lot of time with it other than to question why temporary mitigation being planted with seed at this point is being given credit as additional mitigation. Assuming the temporary mitigation was mitigation, it seems like double accounting, but that maybe I'm missing something there. The bottom line is, I think that this is a health issue, and this has always been a health issue, and progress is being made, but you did sign the SOA in 2018, and here we still sit. Progress is not good enough when it comes to public health. Meeting the goal is really what it's about, and we need more acres this year in order to ensure that that happens. And they do need to be in the most emissive areas. We know that stopping vehicles on the dunes solves the problem. So it's not rocket science. I think I need more areas, emissive areas, just hotspots need to be fenced off and the problem is solved. I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Okay. The next member of the public to speak is Jim Sudi. You may unmute yourself and accept the oath, please.
Yeah, it's Jim Sudi. I accept the oath.
Thank you.
Real quick, we keep hearing from the public that this is a travesty and a health risk issue, and I'd sure like to get clarity on that. This started back when we had the scare of silica and silicosis, and everybody's going to die, and it's very harmful. But the mineral dust coming off the oceanic dunes is inert. Am I correct? And I've seen no scientific data that shows inert material causing harmful health effects. So is inert material a truly harmful effect? And if so, can you point to the scientific data that supports that? Or is this just truly a dust problem we're trying to mitigate? Some clarity would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I do not have any other members that wish to speak at this. Oh, I take that back. One more member of the public, that a couple more members of the public that wishes to speak. Michael Normoyle is next. If you can please unmute yourself and accept the oath.
Good morning. This is Mike Normoyle, and I do accept the oath.
Thank you.
I'm always confusing analogies and metaphors, but let me offer the following framework for some comparison and explanation. View yourselves as the Federal Aviation Administration in charge of aviation safety. Gary Willey is your Chief Compliance and Enforcement Officer. State Parks is Boeing, and the ODSVRA is a key revenue-generating superliner. But there have been crashes with fatalities and concerns about defects in safety systems. One option is to issue a grounding order, investigate the problem, fix it, and then the order can be rescinded and service reinstated. That safe and sure option was available in 2018, but not taken. Instead, company executives offered the following. We're not sure there's a problem, but if you give us a 4-year time frame, if we bring in an all-star group of mechanics and design experts, and we add a project manager, and if you permit us to stay in service, we promise to get things figured out and fixed within that time frame. So stay in the air with passengers on board, figure it out, fix it while we're still flying. Progress reports were also promised, but from the progress reports, we know that the core problem has been identified and fixes are underway, but those fixes are far from complete and demonstrably behind schedule. So the issues are quite simple. First, with public safety and health at stake, what is the compliance officer prepared to do to make sure promises are kept and kept on time? And second, if it becomes necessary, will you be willing to step into the ultimate enforcement role up to and including the issuance of a grounding order? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Next member of the public that wishes to speak is Charles G. Charles, if you can give us your first and last name and accept the oath.
Good morning, Charles Getzoff, and I accept the oath.
Thank you.
My question is, looking ahead, we're using the historic pre-human interaction configuration of the dunes as an emission standard. And I'm wondering, it's given that the dunes emit a lot, and why, looking ahead, could we not help nature to further reduce the emissions? And I would use an analogy. If the dunes was a river that periodically flooded and did damage, we would go ahead and try to mitigate that, with measures. And we wouldn't just say, well, that's the way it was in the past and we'll leave it that way. So that's my question, is looking ahead, can we say that we could help nature further reduce the emissivity of the dunes and still make it healthy and natural out there and be a further benefit to the members of the public and Napomo residents who, with the going just back to the historical emissions, would still be at times exposed to unhealthy air. So that's my question. What's the standard? Can we revisit the standard looking ahead? Thank you.
Thank you. I do not have any more members of the public that wish to speak at this time.
And we'll go ahead and close public comment at this point, and then we'll open it up to any board member questions or comments. Anybody, any member of the board?
This is
Sarah's
Kara.
hand is up. Go ahead. Sorry.
Director Woodruff.
All right, thank you. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. First, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I had a sort of two areas of questions that I wanted to ask about. The first is, it sounds like the scientific advisory group is considering a change in the target. And I had a hard time following the conversation in terms of whether they think the target's not ambitious enough, it would go over for 50%, or whether it be below, or whether you'd have some other different metric. But it seems to me that if the target is not clear, then it may be premature to approve this work plan. Seems to me that you really, really need to know exactly what your target is to know whether this work plan is on pace to achieve that. So that's something I would think that staff at APCD wants to consider. But the other comments I wanted to make are relating to whether we really are making sufficient progress towards that 50% goal, assuming that is the target. And asking this question, I wanted to mention that I've read all the materials. I had the good opportunity to go down to the Oceano Dunes and take a look at the new control areas. I was there with Ronnie Glick of State Parks and Ian Walker of the Scientific Advisory Group, as well as Carl Tupper from APCD. And what I witnessed was impressive. It looks to me that State Parks, APCD, the SAG are all working very cooperatively. It looks like they're testing different types of methods to improve dune geology and advanced vegetation in the control areas. It feels like we've learned some really useful lessons already in a relatively short period of time. And it sounds like what you're doing has truly reduced dust emissions, and progress is being observed and scientifically documented. So I guess my first impression is I feel very impressed by the groups and their progress and the good science that I think is going to be extremely relevant for what's going on at the Oceano Dunes, but also probably very valuable for dune systems throughout the globe. So I just want to acknowledge that. But when I look at the numbers and see where we've come in the last couple of years, the question I have is whether or not we're actually on target for a December 2023 50% reduction rate. It seems like if we had 3 or 4 more years, we would definitely be on target and that goal would be made. But when I look at the data, I don't really, it's not clear to me that we are. So when I look at the data as of July 2020, and correct me if I'm wrong, we understood that dust emissions were reduced by 16.2%. And then the following year, July 2021, this year, the dust emissions were further reduced by 6.1%, and that gets us to over 22%. This new work plan is expected to reduce dust emissions by an additional 9.4%. And so the cumulative reduction at the end of July 22nd looks to be 31.7%. What that means to me is there's still another 19.3% reduction that has to be achieved in an 18-month period ending December 2023. And that pace of reduction appears to be twice as ambitious as what we saw in the most recent data, and also more ambitious than what is being proposed in this new work plan. So it seems to me if you just look at this data, by the time we get to December 2023, we're close, but we're not there. And I wanted to make this point further, I think Raleigh Martin put up a slide, the first scientific advisory group map, the air quality progress map. If you look at that map, clearly progress is being made. But if we only have 18 months, not even 2 years after the July 22nd work plan date, I just don't really see how we get there. And I also want to note in the last couple of years, we've had 6 months where the dunes were closed because off-highway vehicles weren't present due to COVID restrictions. And so these numbers that reflect dust emissions might be overly optimistic if that won't be the case going forward. And so in light of that, I guess my question would be, is it the right time to approve this work plan? Or do we need to use these next couple of months to ask the scientific advisory group to prepare, I think what public commenter said was like a roadmap. What is needed to get to that 50% goal, if that is indeed the goal, by December 2023? And are we really on target to actually get there? Or are we a little bit shy? Are we expecting we need an extra year? Or do we need to take more aggressive action in this next year to really achieve that goal? Because it seems to me all parties agreed that we wanted to reach 50%. We want to do everything in our power to actually meet that goal. That's the law as it now stands. And my recommendation, therefore, by this board, if others agree, is that we hold off approving the work plan until we really nail down what that target is, number one. And number two, we have the parties go back and create a roadmap between now and December 2023, demonstrate that this work plan actually gets us there. And if not, how the work plan might have to be augmented so that we really can get there with the next work plan that will get us through to December 2023. Thank you.
Is that a motion?
Director Carr?
I guess before I make a motion, I'd be interested in hearing from others about whether what I'm saying seems to make sense or whether there's an alternative approach. I hold off for a little bit.
Makes sense to me. I think you're right on there, Kara.
Thank you.
Part of our issue has been that the hearing board capitulated on its responsibilities, I think, beginning of this process. We need to take that back. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Director Carr, are you through?
Yes.
Okay.
I think Director Lapidus has his hand up.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with Kara Woodruff. I was looking at the numbers and drew the exact same conclusions that if you just do the math, we're a bit short. And it seems like if the initial presumption is correct that we need a 50% reduction, and maybe we need to relook at that as well. But if that presumption is correct, then we're not going to make it with the timeline that we have right now. It seems to me we need to be more aggressive. The other thing I wanted to point out was that I'm not sure if people were listening to this presentation, but the World Health Organization made a presentation in September of this year, where they revised their air pollution standards for the first time in 15 years or so. And in terms of PM10 concentrations and PM2.5 concentrations, they revised them downward. They revised almost everything downward. But instead of our current state and federal 20 and 50 recommendations or guideline for PM10, they revised it down to 15 and 45. And instead of our current annual goal of 12 micrograms per meter cubed for PM2.5, they revised it down to 5. So they're becoming a bit more aggressive in terms of what their standards should be. And I'm wondering if there's any discussion about these new standards on our state level or local level. Has anyone given this some consideration, or how that might play into what our goals should be? Because our goals are based on our current guideline of 20 and 50. And I'm wondering if these new World Health Organization guidelines are being considered.
Would you like me to answer that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I'm sure they're being considered at the state and federal level. We've always known that the PM 2.5 is probably, needing to be adjusted downward. It's the most significant particulate level, and regardless of what the components are, whether it's silica or some inert material, it's just the size of that particle that causes the problem. So when Mr. Sudi spoke about the health effects versus crystalline silica versus inert material, we have only been analyzing it on the inert material factors and the risks involved with exceeding those air standards. So yes, we are looking at those standards. Locally, we don't adopt air quality standards. We're probably free to do so as a governing board, but our governing board hasn't us directed to do so. And I know of no other governing board in local air pollution field that has their own standards. But yeah, sure. I know the federal government is looking heavily into the 2.5 standard, as well as probably the PM standard, because the federal level for PM 10 is 150 versus California's 50. So I know the feds are looking at that for sure. And as far as the comments on meeting the goals of the stipulated order of abatement on time, it was my intention to bring this item back to your board in March, and at that point we could decide, how many acres have to be taken out immediately next year to meet that requirement if this board doesn't grant a different timeline or other relief mechanisms, so that we would get there by the plan. It just would be a large change, next year. That'll give us some time to finish the computational fluid dynamic modeling that the SAG needs to do to get this finished. And it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. You hit something over here and something comes up. So it's not as easy as as just putting some controls on a stack and saying, okay, it's done. It's a very difficult environment that we're working in. So given the way the order is written, I have the approvability of the plan, and this board can then convene itself and override my approval. But it's my jurisdiction on approving the plan as it is. Of course, I'm going to consider your comments, because the last thing I want to do is do something against those comments. But the process wise is that I listen to both the hearing board and the public comments, and then decide what to do with the this year's ARWP. And mind you that we can't afford to wait long to go through the rest of the processes to get approvals, to get these things on the ground. So if we delay approval of this plan, we're going to run into a worse situation than we had last year, which with the permitting through the Coastal Commission process, we'll get bogged down and we won't get this stuff done in the springtime before, when it's still raining. So I'll turn it back over to the chair.
Mr. Chair, maybe it's a good time for me to speak. I'm Tim McNulty. I'm counsel to the hearing board. If the hearing board wants to do anything, because today we're only noticed for a public workshop, it really would need to set another hearing, a hearing at which it could consider, for example, whether or not to accept the APCO's approval of the work plan. Specifically, the hearing board could review whether or not the work plan is adequate, should have been accepted by the APCO, or should not have been. But we can't really do that at today's hearing. I think the most we can do, given the notice that we have here, which is a workshop notice, is to set another hearing where we could have an agenda which would include on it an item to consider the Air Pollution Control District officers' approval of the work plan and potential modifications to the work plan. So if there was, if it's the intention of the hearing board to do something along the lines of what Ms. Woodruff has suggested, we would need to do that in a different way than I think what's been presumed up to this point during the meeting. So.
Thank you, Ms. McNulty. And if to follow up on that, I will go ahead and make a motion that we hold another hearing board meeting, hopefully within possibly 30 days, in which to consider modifications to the stipulated order of abatement. And I would actually look toward possibly increasing the number of acres. I saw a figure about 190 acres to be included, as well as possible restrictions in ridership in the highly admissive areas.
Do we have a second for that motion?
I second the motion.
I have a question about the motion, if that's okay.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Could the motion be amended, or could I suggest an amendment to the motion or an addition?
Yes.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, Mr. Chair, if we could include in your motion a specific task to request that some kind of work plan be prepared and presented for consideration by the board, so that we're talking about not just looking at the work plan that takes us through July 22nd, but a roadmap between now and when the deadline occurs in December of 2023.
Yes, be happy to make that motion. Only comment that I have on that might be is I think that's kind of a two-part process here, and correct me, Mr. McNulty, if I'm wrong here, that the stipulated order of abatement is what's the direction that we have right now, and that's what we have to modify. And then, so I'm thinking if we go ahead and modify the stipulated order of abatement at a future hearing, then we would be able to accomplish what it is that we're.
If I understand the existing stipulated order of abatement correctly, there's a provision there that allows the hearing board, assuming it has a vote to do so, to modify any condition or order or deadline sort of made under the stipulated order of abatement. So I think if there are votes for this, and it sounds like there might be, I think what you want to do is direct your staff to agendize a meeting of the hearing board that would allow you to consider modifications to both the stipulated order of abatement and the work plan, or consider an alternative work plan for that matter. I think before you vote, we ought to hear from Mr. Willie about what his staff is capable of producing in the time period within which they're capable of producing it, because I think it's more than just setting another meeting. It's not going to be that valuable to you unless you have something to look at other than what you've already been presented today. So I think we need to be clear about just what we're capable of accomplishing and in what time frame.
Yeah, I think, given the direction of this board, I would propose that we do it in the January timeframe, to give us enough time to get this stuff done and to allow us to proceed with the current mitigation so that we can get those permitted on time, and then add the additional stuff that can be done over the next year that this board desires. So I don't want to lose another winter, spring season without getting plants on the ground and getting things converted. So, we can approve the partial knowing that this board was going to reconsider the SOA conditions completely and add on to that. That would be, my suggestion of this board is to allow us some time to digest and get something ongoing to you that's going to satisfy what this board desires to do.
You know, I can't ask Gary, and I think it was Carl's presentation, or it might have been Raleigh's presentation, that the need for a little more modeling, is that also going to be built into this time frame to better refine the modeling that has been done so far?
I'm unsure when that's going to be completed. We had initially, at the end of this meeting, we were going to select the next hearing date, and then that's when we were going to consider that for March. So everything that we've talked about, I had planned to, in order to get to is to bring this, instead of the hearing board actually bringing the petition, opening it up, I was going to file a petition to open it up and address these things, where this board would have the chance to say, okay, just go ahead and take this out of circulation and meet it, or do this plan. So it was already going to occur in March under my planning to do so, and that was going to be sufficient time to get the modeling complete. I'm unsure. I'd have to ask the scientific advisory group.
Jack
and
Gillies
DRI.
is still on the line if you'd like to ask him about the modeling questions. And Director Anderson also has his hand up.
Okay, I'll just finish that on that, and Director Anderson can come in.
Did we have questions of Mr. Gillies?
Yes.
I can just fill you in on a couple of things. For the computational fluid dynamics work that the Desert Research Institute is doing, we expect to deliver our draft report of findings to Parks on that work by the end of October. The other modeling work that was referenced with respect to potentially influencing the target for the stipulated order of abatement, I'm not sure the timing on that. The science advisory group will need to recommend a series of steps for the modeling team to undertake to provide them with the information that they're looking for, and that is, they can make the request for the DRI modeling team to do that. Convolutedly, that request will have to go to Parks, and Parks will provide the go-ahead to DRI under their contract to do that modeling. But at this point, the guidance of the science advisory group on the steps that they want to examine in that modeling is not yet defined. So I don't know the time frame of that.
Okay. Director Anderson, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thank you. My comment is this: I don't have any problem revisiting the timing of the stipulated order of abatement, or even having input on next year's work plan. But I would hate to hold up this year's work plan, while we have another meeting and make comments on this year's work plan. I would encourage us to encourage the Air Pollution Control Officer to approve the work plan this year, and then we can go ahead and meet and make sure we're early enough to where we have comments and input and suggested changes, maybe to the SOA or maybe the 2022 work plan. But if we hold it up now, we're going to lose a year basically, and I just would hate to see us do that. That's my comment. Thank you.
Actually, Gary, I'll ask you again. I had, in part of my motion, having a meeting within 30 days. You are suggesting instead January.
I would prefer March, but January is about as soon as I can get enough resources and enough information together to do it. I mean, we're in a very litigious society right now, and I want to make sure that all my ducks are lined up in a row, and that we, everything is in place to make sure that our process is bulletproof.
Okay.
By December, Roy.
I'm sorry, Mr. Carr.
By December.
What about December?
Yes.
It's possible to do it in December. I think that, whatever we do, the resources that we have to actually do plantings and things like that are, we're not going to be able to generate enough where it matters, whether we take stuff out of writing later in the springtime or late winter, say the March timeframe, if this body decides to do that at that point. I think it would be essentially the same effectiveness. There's not a lot of change that happens that we would see by taking it out of writing earlier. There's not a lot of traffic out there in the wintertime. It's just, after Christmas, Thanksgiving, it's just kind of quiet out there pretty much. So to me, I would prefer to recommend that we hold this for March, and we can decide, whatever this board decides to do. I mean, you're free to take it all out of, there's no provision that says you can't shut the whole thing down at that point. So to me, I prefer the March timeframe. I think January is doable. I think December is going to lead to no real change in what happens, other than putting stress on the system, on our process anyway, not the system, not the ecosystem, but our process.
Well, we had a motion and a second. If anybody would like to make a substitute motion.
Director Woodruff has her hand up.
Director Woodruff.
So I'm compelled by Mr. Willie and Mr. Anderson. I agree. We don't want to lose valuable time. And so it does make sense to me to have the Air Pollution Control District go ahead and proceed and approve the plan, perhaps as they so desire. And I agree, a little extra time is probably a good thing, because I know if they are to consider creation of a work roadmap, I think that's obviously a large task, and it needs time to do it right. So I'd be very comfortable if we were to request a meeting, and February or March maybe would be the appropriate time frame. But I do agree. I don't think we want to do anything that undermines progress during the winter months.
Director Anderson, did you have a comment? Okay. You're muted, Director Anderson.
Sorry, pressed the wrong button.
No problem.
No, I don't have any more comments. I echo what Director Woodruff just said.
Okay.
Again, would any director like to make a motion?
Well, we have a motion on the table with a first and a second. So I think, Mr. McNulty, we would need to have either the motion maker amend his motion, and I believe the second also needs to agree with the amendment.
Or we could withdraw the motion and proceed to try to set a hearing date in February or March. That would work as well, too.
No, I'll move to withdraw my motion and accept a substitute motion.
Do we need a vote on the withdrawal, Mr. McNulty?
No, let's not do that.
Okay. I do have a placeholder for a March meeting already on March 23rd, 2022. Would you like me to try and find something sooner, or is that acceptable?
February.
I can certainly, if it's the board's wish, I can certainly look for a time frame in February.
My suggestion, following along with what Mr. Willie said, why don't we look at the placeholder date of March 22nd?
March 23rd.
23rd, I'm sorry.
Okay. 2022. Okay. So we did kind of skip to the next agenda item, which was to set the next hearing board. So we went ahead and do we need a motion and a vote on accepting March 23rd?
I think in addition to setting that date, what we need to make clear in the motion is that at that date, it's not merely going to be an update on progress, but rather the agenda and the notice will put the hearing board in a position to be able to propose changes to the stipulated order of abatement and or the work plans or conditions as they've been implemented. And I think if we have that, then people can feel somewhat comfortable in the idea that it won't be just another, progression of workshops and reports, but rather it'll be a chance to make substantive amendments.
Mr. Chair, did you want to try? I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, do you want to try making another motion?
I'd be happy to. I'd like to make a proposal to schedule a hearing board meeting on March 23rd of 2022, at which point both specifically a review of the any possible changes to the stipulated order of abatement.
Okay, so I have the motion as to schedule the next APCD hearing board meeting for March 23rd, 2022, at which point the board will consider modifications to the stipulated order of abatement 1701.
And Mr. McNulty, is that broad enough to include a review of the approval of the work plan, the creation of a roadmap, or considering whether the target is still acceptable?
I think it could be broader, just to be clear for everyone. It might be broader if it also talked about, review of the work plan, review of conditions of the work plan, review of deadlines and other associated components of it. I think that would give everyone comfort in knowing that pretty much everything's on the table. So if we could add it, if Alyssa, if the motion maker would agree and the second would agree, we could just make reference in the motion also to review of the work plan and potential changes to the work plan as well.
Okay, so maker of the motion, I'd be happy to modify my motion to also include at that March 23rd, 2022 meeting a review of the work plan for the coming year, and also a roadmap for continuing compliance.
Okay, so to reiterate, the motion is going to be to schedule the next meeting on March 23rd, 2022 for consideration and possible modification of stipulated order of abatement 1701 and review and possible modification of the 2021 annual report and work plan. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, and I have a motion, but I don't have a second on this particular motion. Thank you, Mr. Carr. Are we ready for roll call? Do we have board member comments on this? Mr. Director Anderson, I thought I saw your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want, did we also, because we're going to be so far through the 2020 work plan, and at that time, did we also need to agendize that the board potentially wants to make comments on the 2022 work plan, even though it won't be ready yet, but give, input on that? In other words, we're kind of meeting at mid-cycle. It's going to be kind of hard to adjust fire on the 2021, I think. I don't know if we need to agendize that we may give some input on what we want to see in the 2022 work plan. I don't know. Maybe a pollution control officer can weigh in on that.
Thank you, Director Anderson. We have the ability through this process to change everything within the order. So I think you're covered with that general noticing the general motion that's out there. So I think we can cover that, given the direction. This board will just basically, hardwire in what it expects to see in the incoming in the incoming year at that point. So, you know.
You dropped off, Gary.
What's that, Tim?
You dropped off the last part of your sentence there.
Oh, I don't know what I missed on that.
But
anyway,
I think you're correct. I mean, I think if the motion referred to work plans plural, then we could make sure we were covering more the 21 and the proposed 2022. I think when it comes down to it, with regard to the 2022 work plan in March, you're going to be trying to give direction to staff on that. It won't have yet been adopted. So at that point, you're really just providing direction to your APCD staff.
Correct.
So do we want to remove the reference to any year for annual report and work plans?
We just make work plans plural, right? Wouldn't that do it?
Okay.
I agree.
Okay. Okay, so the motion one more time is to schedule the meeting for March 23rd, 2022, at which point the board will consider modification of stipulated order of abatement 1701 and review and possible changes to annual report and work plans. Is that correct?
Yes.
Motion maker is Director Johnson. Second is Director Carr. Are we ready for a roll call vote?
Yes.
Okay, Director Johnson,
Yes.
Director Anderson,
Yes.
Director Carr,
Yes.
Director Lapidus,
Yes.
Director Woodruff.
Yes.
Vote is unanimous. Okay.
We have to go back to open public comment.
Yes, we need public comment on items not on the agenda.
Yes.
Okay, we'll open it for public comment for any item not on the agenda.
Okay. I do not see at this time any members of the public that wish to speak on items not on the agenda.
Okay, we'll go ahead and close public comment.
And I believe we had skipped to selecting the next hearing board update. So at this point, there's no further business.
Okay, unless there's any other comments by any of the directors or Mr. McNulty or Mr. Willie, we're scheduled to meet again on March 23rd of next year.
2022.
Okay. Thank
Sounds
you.
good. Thanks for running such a good meeting.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.